And if you have a good salesperson or if you have a good account executive or whoever it is that's responsible for communicating this thing to a prospect, they need to be trained on these types of issues and how to communicate that to a customer so that at the very least, the customer can be educated on what really is an MSP and what isn't an MSP. They can be educated on what the modern day cybersecurity practices and expectations are for organizations, depending on which jurisdiction they happen to reside in and operate in. And you can also explain to them what you are willing to do and what you are capable of doing for them and why that comes at a cost. And if they then say, well, it's not about budget, it's just about, I don't want to pay this because I don't think you're worth it. Should you lower your price? Honestly, I would say no. If it was me, I would say don't. If you're worth it, you're worth it. Now, you can be overpriced. I want to talk about a age-old issue, debate, dilemma, call it what you will, but it's not new. And the question, the issue is, how do you compete against a MSP that is driving down pricing, race to the bottom, right? There's so many different euphemisms and phrases used for this, but it's basically the effect of you're negotiating with an MSP customer, a prospect, and you want to close that prospect, and they bring up, well, this vendor, this MSP, they can do the same thing that you're saying. They can do it for half the price or a third of the price or whatever it is, right? They just say they can do it cheaper. How do you respond? What should you say? Can that type of a prospect be salvaged? Should you lower your price? Should you match the price and hope to win the business? Is that the best recourse? Well, probably not, but what should you do? Stay tuned. There are some very simple things that you should know and do in order to deal with these kind of bottom pricing vendors, MSPs out there who are, trying to be disruptive. And they're trying to be disruptive for a reason. We'll get into that momentarily. But there are some things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do that we'll talk about and position your MSP practice for optimal success. And it's not difficult. They're very simple practices, very simple things to do, and we'll explain all of them. Stay tuned. Okay. When I hear price competition in managed services, typically hear it from certain markets, and it's not always this way, but more often than not, it tends to be this way. And I'll explain what some of those scenarios are right now. I used to hear price competitive issues a lot from Florida in the United States. The state of Florida and MSPs in the state of Florida would frequently bring up at either MSP World Conference or at small conference one-day events that we would do in Florida. And they would always say, well, Charles, we're seeing such tremendous pressure for price reduction, price competitiveness, they would call it. And how do we deal with that? Invariably, the first thing that I would say to someone who's saying that type of a thing, I would say is, are you really competing against an MSP, right? So here's the scenario. Let's say you are an MSP. You know you're an MSP. Hopefully you really are. That's a separate issue. But let's assume that for the sake of argument, you are an MSP and you're talking to a prospect that you're chasing. You want to close them as a managed services customer, and they bring up to you, we got your proposal. We like it. It's very thorough, but we've been talking to some other people, some other resources, and we think that, there are cheaper alternatives for the same thing. And, do you have any thoughts about that? There's a variety of reasons why someone would say that to you as an MSP in chasing down the deal. The first one, the most obvious one, is they're trying to chisel you down. They're trying to lower your price. They're trying to, maybe in an inelegant way, try to negotiate on price. There are cultures around the world where if you don't negotiate and haggle on price, it's considered a it's considered bad form. It's considered rude almost, right? You're expected to haggle, to negotiate. If you don't, something's wrong. They will expect you to do it. The United States, I would say there's probably, geographic regions. There are probably industries where haggling is very common. I mean, I would say cars, car dealerships used to be notorious for haggling on price. It used to be so prevalent in the automotive industry that they have, for the most part, when I go to a car dealership now, there's like almost no fun because you can't negotiate with these people. There's like, oh no, I'm sorry, this is the price. This is the only price you're going to get. Maybe they have some monthly promotions going on, but they've taken away the authority and the ability for salespeople to practice what used to be the fine art of negotiation, at least in the automotive industry. And in managed services, I think that there still is price competitiveness because I still see it coming up. I still see dime a dozen consultants, running workshops and doing training seminars and publishing podcasts and writing white papers and doing, even we're doing it, right? I mean, we're talking about an issue which clearly has not been resolved yet. So the first thing you really need to do is ask yourself, okay, I understand what's happening. The customer is pushing back. Maybe they're trying to negotiate. Maybe they're real. Maybe they've actually shown you a competing proposal or quote from another vendor, another MSP. Most of the scenarios I've heard of, there is no proof or evidence. It's just verbal. I talked to some people and they said that, what you're proposing should be worth this. What do you think? Right? That's kind of an inartful, a little inelegant to say way to negotiate, right? There are better ways to do it. How should you respond? Step one, find out whether you're really dealing with something that's real or imagined. And start by asking follow-up questions. So here's what I would ask a hypothetical prospect who's interested in buying managed services from my hypothetical MSP business, and they have brought up the issue of price. And they brought up the issue of price being cheaper from some other hypothetical, unnamed, unidentified MSP. You can't effectively negotiate with kind of the straw man argument of a maybe fabricated but an unknown entity, right? You can't position yourself and say, be forced to compare yourself with something that is unknown. You're going to lose. You're almost always going to lose that because you don't have enough information, right? This is not a debate where both sides are presenting an issue and they have to present facts, right? Your potential customer has presented to you a scenario where their expectation is you're going to lower your price in order to win the deal. First of all, and don't be surprised that you're not being used to negotiate for another MSP who's actually going to end up winning the deal. And you're just there to offer a competitive bid that's going to be used as leverage for someone else. That happens. We all know that happens. But you first need to be comparing, as we in the United States say so frequently, it has to be an apples to apples comparison, a true comparison of similar values in order to be fair and constructive. And to say that and getting back to my Florida example for so many years, I used to hear price competition problems and complaints from MSPs. And I would tell them, look, do you know that you're talking about and being compared to another MSP, or maybe are you being compared to a VAR, a break fix company? And then they would say, well, how would you know? Well, you start by looking at the price itself and trying to kind of do a quick reverse engineer of what are they saying that they're going to get at the price. And if a customer prospect of yours is saying everything that you are delivering to them in your quote can be derived from another provider for less cost, find out exactly what the cost is. Start by asking questions, the questions that you need in order to respond to their hypothetical. If they're wanting you to lower your price, I think it's very fair to find out, are you talking to an actual MSP? And here's what I would also say. Well, let's start by looking at a true comparison. If you're not sure that they're really an MSP, here's my MSP Verify report for our organization. Ask for the same thing from them. Because until you get some sort of bona fides or credentials from this organization, they could be some fly-by-night cyber VAR that's out there. They've just been in business for like 2 weeks. You're their first prospect. They're chasing down. They're going to do anything to win this business. They're going to lose money if they have to get this business. And do you really want to be signing on with that type of, do you want to sign on with a first-year doctor to do your brain surgery? Or do you want someone who's done this for many, many years, many operations under their belt, right? Start with, are they truly an MSP? Establish your own credentials, establish your own. And the more you do that, right, the more you start to present yourself as, here are our credentials, here are our capabilities, this is what we will do. You're doing a couple things. You're reaffirming your own value. You're reaffirming and establishing your credibility and your credentials. You are also setting a benchmark, which you hope, we both hope, is going to be insurmountable by the maybe real, but if it's a hypothetical, then it won't matter. But if it's a hypothetical provider that the customer is just making up to see if you're going to drop your price, you're raising the bar and educating your customer, your prospect, on why you are valuable and why you're worth the money. And sometimes that's really what's going on, is the prospect is actually going through this exercise to really find out, what am I talking to someone who's really truly a professional, or am I dealing with yet another fly-by-night, kind of break-fix company that masquerades as an MSP? If you don't think that those exist, sorry to burst your bubble with it, but they do exist. And there's a fair amount of them out there. And customers we are now, folks, 3 decades into managed services, right? Since the mid to early 90s, managed services providers have walked the earth. They are amongst us, and they've been operating. And there are good ones and there are bad ones. And at this point, with that amount of elapsed time, the customers on this planet have had more than ample opportunity to experience their fair share of good and bad MSPs. And there are actually some organizations that are quite adept at determining who is a true MSP and who isn't, because they've been through enough of those relationships, right? And so you could be dealing with one of those they've been burned a few times and they don't want to do it again. And so they're really trying to vet you, and they're vetting you by playing these games of, well, it's a price game, but it's also a competency game. It's also a where's your floor in terms of price. And that's one of their ways of finding out who they're really dealing with. Don't be surprised if that's going on. Finding out if the alternative competing MSP is really an MSP, which leads to the second issue of really getting to the heart of, are they a reactive provider or a proactive provider? If they call themselves an MSP, it doesn't matter what they call themselves. It's what they actually deliver that matters. And you can hide an awful lot in terms of a greatly reduced price. You could call it a managed IT service. You could call it an IT maintenance program. And I'm going to bill you every month, so you're going to have a predictability of billing. And the customer says, well, that's awesome. It sounds really like managed services, but guess what? It's nothing like managed services. It's not managed services. It's just a billable block hour of time. And we all know that's not managed services. But that's, in this scenario, what you're being compared to. Well, you need to push back, and you could say, hey, we're not block hour, just monthly invoicing. That's why you're managed services. No, we're actually doing things in a proactive way. We're doing things the way a legitimate, certified compliant MSP practice ought to be doing them. And this is the standard that you ought to be holding all of your providers to. And I think that approach of starting to educate the customer on what you are and not going down the path of dropping your price is the best approach. So establish that you're really an MSP. Ask whether or not they're dealing with a true MSP who's giving them this greatly discounted price. Ask about that vendor and whether they're actually delivering proactive IT services or just reactive IT services. Explain to them the difference, explain why it's important, explain how they can figure out whether they're going to be getting just reactive services or proactive managed IT services, etc. Ask about security. Today, more than ever, it is quite appropriate, especially in the small and mid-sized business market where I'm talking less, not the co-managed environments and relationships that you would likely see in mid-market or enterprise. Security is going to be expected. It's going to be expected that security is baked into your managed services offering, and find out if that's being omitted in this rock bottom price that they're comparing you to. In many cases, wouldn't be surprised if they're just leaving that out altogether, right? I've seen so many comparatives, where they just leave off like wholesale things, and they just, it's intentionally left off. That's how they get the price so low, and a kind of all in, not necessarily all you can eat, but a kind of a baseline threshold floor set by an MSP that says, you're my new customer. This is the minimum that you're going to be able to do with us. And that comes at a price. And then the customer says, well, I can go get this from someplace else for less. Well, yeah, if that would be like, I'm going to buy a house that was built by an engineer and approved by, appropriate relevant city inspectors and safety professionals, or I'm going to get a house for half the price that was built by somebody who isn't an engineer, isn't a carpenter, isn't a general contractor. They don't know anything about housing, but they're going to sell you a house for half price. Oh, and by the way, it's going to have no fire extinguishers, no fire alarms. It's going to be made out of highly combustible material, and it'll probably fall down in 6 months. Yeah, which one are you going to buy? Okay, the cheap becomes expensive. Very appropriate phrase that I like to remind everyone about in these scenarios. Finally, after you've gone through the appropriate security, cyber hygiene threshold that you expect from yourself as an MSP and what you expect all managed services customers to be at, and you can go through as lengthy an explanation as you want about different compliance frameworks. You could, if you're in the state of Texas, you could bring up things such as the Texas bill that is now Texas law, the safe harbor cybersecurity managed services immunity law that talks about, minimum thresholds of compliance in the state of Texas. Otherwise, you're going to be subjected to punitive damages if you have a data or security incident and you get involved in a civil litigation. I mean, you could go through those types of things and say, we anticipate those. We help you protect against those types of scenarios. This proposal that you're putting in front of us doesn't come close to preparing you for that type of cyber hygiene and cyber safe harbor protection, right? I mean, you could go that far, and maybe you should, in dealing with a customer prospect who is really just trying to get a percentage off. I want to say this. If you've done all this, if you've communicated all of this to a customer and they just say to you, hey, it's about budget. This is our budget. This is what we have to spend. It is what it is. You can't squeeze blood from a stone. This is it. This is the maximum we are going to do. In my experience, those types of people who are more upfront and communicating with you, they're not going to pull these straw man, games and say, well, I talked to another vendor. I'm not going to tell you who they are, but they've given me a quote and they can do this work for, less than you're presenting. That typically doesn't happen when it's just purely a budget issue. They understand your value. They like who you are. They like what you do. They believe that you're credible. They believe you're certified. They believe you're compliant, you're best practice, you're professional, all that. It's just they don't have the money to pay you. They will typically just tell you that pretty early on in the process. And then it can become a I will work with you scenario, or a there's no way what you want can be delivered for this price. And those are I don't want to say they're tricky, but those are more respectable dilemmas to be confronted with than this hypothetical. I can just do the job cheaper for the same thing, because it's almost never the same thing. It's almost always a very, very different deliverable that is being presented at a greatly reduced price. So I think that there's a responsibility for the MSP. And if you have a good salesperson, or if you have a good account executive, or whoever it is that's responsible for communicating this thing to a prospect, they need to be trained on these types of issues and how to communicate that to a customer, so that at the very least, the customer can be educated on what really is an MSP and what isn't an MSP. They can be educated on what the modern day cybersecurity practices and expectations are for organizations, depending on which jurisdiction they happen to reside in and operate in. And you can also explain to them what you are willing to do and what you are capable of doing for them, and why that comes at a cost. And if they then say, well, it's not about budget, it's just about, I don't want to pay this because I don't think you're worth it, should you lower your price? Honestly, I would say no. If it was me, I would say don't. If you're worth it, you're worth it. Now, you can be overpriced. You can be overpriced. But, generally speaking, if you're astute enough, if you're aware enough, you generally know that there is a market threshold for the services you deliver. And you, being aware, know that you're in a bandwidth which is acceptable to a certain demographic of customer. And if you start to play outside that, specifically lower than that, that's where you start to get into this race to the bottom with price. The MSPs that are highly profitable, very mature, they are growth oriented, and not that they don't have problems, but they're a mature MSP. They generally don't have price competition discussions. They may have budget discussions, it happens all the time, but they don't have, I can get this cheaper from somebody else types of discussions. Those happen at the bottom of the market, where you're dealing largely with break fix, reactive types of providers. A lot of VARs operate in this model. In fact, that's a prototypical, very common value-added reseller tactic, because that's how a VAR salesman learned how to sell and close business. Because in that scenario, it is not about the product. The product will not change. The product it's a widget, whatever the thing is. It's about price. It's solely about price. To become a true professional in managed services is to extract yourself from that VAR sales mentality, and to begin to develop and establish yourself as a not just trusted, but a deserving of trust MSP. And that type of MSP will rarely, not never, but rarely be confronted with customers who insist on being exposed to this race to the bottom in price. And if they just finally won't relent, maybe, just maybe, it's a good thing to let them go. Not every customer is a good customer. And the good MSPs, good companies in general, know how to identify a good customer and go after them and pay attention to them. And they especially know how to identify a bad customer and quickly identify whether that's going to be somebody they want to chase, or whether they just let them go, cut them loose, and don't waste your time on them. That sometimes is the best and only option that you can have. And don't be surprised if that customer that you cut loose comes back to you. I've seen that happen many, many times. So don't race to the bottom when it comes to price. Stand firm, establish your value, educate your customer, present your bona fides, present your certification, your compliance, your credibility. Once you've established that, stand firm and educate, and good things will happen. Stay safe. Until next time.